Back in 1963, when they were making An Unearthly Child, they definitely didn't know that they were starting something as massive as they truly were. It was just some British people making some British show, and if you ask me, there's something pretty wonderful about that. Now, almost 55 years later, we are anticipating the show's cumulative 37th season in Series 11 of the revived series. But I don't really have to tell you this because if you're watching it, you already know all about the show and you're probably just wondering my thoughts on it. So let's take a look back at the start of something beautiful, An Unearthly Child. Now, before we get right into it, I do want to say that I'm going to do my best to look at this episode in its own right and not put ungrounded pressure on it simply because of when it started. And I'll look at it simply as an episode of television from 1963, and I'll do my best to not be overly critical of the limitations that they had when making this show, but of course, my perspective is that I am a guy from 2018 who has seen all of New Who and probably about 1/6 of Classic Who. So it's going to be hard to look at it from someone else's perspective, from someone that was from 1963. It's going to be hard to not see it from my perspective, from a 2018 perspective, because I am from 2018. But I'm just going to do my best. And as far as my history with William Hartnell's portrayal of the Doctor, I've only seen him in this episode and the Aztecs so far. With that out of the way, let's talk about the first part of the story for starters, and it's good. It's really good, and I hadn't seen this one in a few years, and I'm glad it's as good as I remember, and actually, it's even a little better than I remember. And also beware of some mild spoilers if you haven't seen this episode before, but if you're watching this video, then it's quite likely that you already have. So I do really like how this episode plays out, opening with a scene in Junkyard, which is quite mysterious and atmospheric, and then we move on to Barbara and Ian, and we begin to learn about how strange their student has been behaving, and we see the curiosity in themselves, and we begin to get curious ourselves. And it's really strange how Susan is behaving. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to tune into your television set on November 23rd, 1963, not having any clue how the story would unfold, because obviously from my perspective I kind of know what's going on already because I know where the show ends up, so I can make certain leaps in logic that people at the time simply could not have. So I just wish that I could have had that experience, because that would have been pretty cool. It is admittedly a little bit odd that two teachers follow a student to her home and, let's be honest, commit a little bit of light stalking. It's also probably a little too far for me and maybe unlikely, but I do get it, and they're curious, and I'm also just as curious, so I'm willing to roll with it. So I'm really glad that they did. And I do like Ian's line when he says that they can't excuse curiosity, because he's not trying to justify what they're doing. He's just curious, and he's being honest about that, so I enjoyed that. Our introduction to the Doctor is interesting, and the way the conversation goes between him, Barbara, and Ian is a fun little song and dance as he tries to convince them that there's no reason to be there, and then they're just not buying it whatsoever, and Ian believes that he has her locked inside the box, and aspects like that would have made it very interesting to watch this episode for the first time back when it came out. And the way the episode plays with us and doesn't fully let us know what's going on until a good portion of the way through the episode is really cool, and we're given a mystery, and we have these strange elements dangled in front of us, and they just don't make much sense to us, and then we're very curious, and we want to know what it all means, and we don't, and by the time that we are actually in the junkyard, it reaches a peak when they meet the Doctor, and they just can't seem to make sense of any of it. But the best part of the whole first episode for me is when we actually do get to go inside of that police box. And it's rather sizable and futuristic looking room, and it's really interesting to watch. And again, I just wish I knew how it was to watch this episode back when it first came out. And during that scene, we get our first "it's bigger on the inside" scene, and that plays out a little differently than I'm accustomed to seeing it in New Who, so that was pretty cool to see. And we also get the first utterance of the words Doctor Who from William Hartnell himself. That's pretty fun to see. And what stood out to me the most was when Susan said that she had coined the term TARDIS. And at first I thought, whoa, how did I not know this already? And I've even seen this episode before too. That's kind of huge for a Doctor Who fan like me to not know that. And then I thought to myself, does that make sense with what Doctor Who has done in the future? And while I'm not sure if it does, what I am certain about is that this episode would not be at fault for the decision they made in later Who. So if it doesn't make sense because of inconsistencies in later episodes, this episode gets a pass for it, and it's on those episodes for the inconsistencies because this was the first episode. So that's that. And again, I'm not sure if it makes sense. So what does it even matter? And I'm still not sure what I think about the Doctor being unwilling to let Barbara and Ian go. And I think I'm willing to buy into it because this is a much earlier point in his life that I'm used to seeing him. And it would make sense if he feels this way in his early days. But also it's worth noting that he wasn't completely against the idea. He was willing to let two of them go as long as he was not around to suffer the consequences that he assumed would come of their knowledge of the time travel technology, and specifically himself and his granddaughter Susan. Although I do find it really interesting that he was willing to leave Susan behind, or at least he said that he was. And I do have to wonder if he actually would have done so. And this is a very interesting point in the Doctor's life, and I'm really interested to learn more about it in future episodes. Now, on rewatching this episode, I made the mistake of putting in the DVD and hitting the play all button, which was to my downfall actually, because the DVD also contained the unaired pilot. So I watched the unaired pilot, and then the next episode turned out to be the pilot that they actually aired, which upon realizing I skipped it to watch the next 3 parts, but upon doing a tiny bit of research, I decided that I couldn't do a review unless I had seen the televised and Unearthly Child episode. Well, seen it recently, that is. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, basically, they shot the pilot, then they decided it was not good enough, and then they shot it again for televised broadcasting. And when I rewatched it, at first it seemed like there were so few changes between the two that I didn't understand the need to entirely reshoot the pilot. And there was the odd thing here or there, and a shot change, and some minor dialogue differences, but they seemed to be doing the same thing, which honestly they did. But the more I watched the refilmed episode, the more changes I began to notice. And while the episodes are very similar, I think the reshot episode does run just a bit smoother, and there are scenes that play just a little bit better. And the one that stands out to me the most is the scene when Barbara and Ian enter the junkyard and have a conversation with the Doctor, and it just feels a little more realistic, and I just like it better. And I do actually think Carol Ann Ford does give a little bit better of a performance in the reshot episode. And it's not game-changing, but it's enough that I noticed. And I do like the line added from Susan when she is reading a book called The French Revolution, and she says, "That's not right." And that's not a massive change, but it's just a little thing that adds a bit of mystery and a bit of what's going on, you know? So it just runs a little bit cleaner, and I do like it just a hair more. I think that's about all I have to say about the first part of the story, so I think I'm going to move on and touch on the later parts. And I think it's worth mentioning the general consensus when discussing these first 4 episodes. And to my understanding, most people think that the first episode is somewhere between good to great, and that the following 3 are somewhere between okay and, well, some would even say they're bad. And I somewhat agree with that consensus. I do think the first part is really good, and parts 2 through 4 are pretty good in my opinion, but they just aren't as strong. And as far as what I do like, I think it was a good decision to go back to the quote-unquote cavemen or cave people times for the first out of time adventure. And Russell T Davies chose to do the opposite thing in The End of the World, following Rose when they went far into the future. And I think that both of these are smart ways to start off the show. Just there's the polar opposites, and it just makes sense to me. However, while I think this is a good concept, I don't think it plays out the best. There are good moments and bad, but overall I found it to be uneven. And while I did generally like it, the cave people, and yes, I'm gonna call them that, the cave people just didn't always work for me. And sometimes they just felt cartoonish and like caricatures, and I'm not sure how to do it better really, but maybe just toning them down to some extent would have done the trick. I'm really not sure how to get this story working the right way that it's supposed to, but how it is played out this way, it's just a bit uneven. And they were interesting, but they didn't always work, and they were definitely the weakest aspect of the story. And something I like is when they go back to save the man who's been hurt, and even though they themselves are in danger, and although the Doctor is opposed to doing this in this episode, I think that it is just something that will become more a part of him with time. And because in this episode, He is very against it, and I'm finding it very interesting to see the difference in the Doctor at this point in time as opposed to the point in time that I am accustomed to knowing him, because they're very different, and it's very interesting to just see that. And there's a line that I really like in this episode where the Doctor says, "Fear, it makes companions of us all." And we get to hear him use the phrase companion, and although he did use it earlier in the episode actually, but this is the time when it actually stood out to me as worth something, and it was related to, well, the Doctor and his companions. So that was pretty cool, and it's fun just to see the origins of this show in this story. I'm not sure what else to talk about with specifics, honestly, so I think I'm just going to touch on some broader strokes now, like characters. So let's talk about Barbara. I do like Barbara. She feels realized and strong, and I think that when she breaks down, it makes sense, given the circumstances and how out of element she is to the whole scenario. And although the show tuned up her screaming just a little bit too much in this first episode, I do like her. Ian. It seems that Ian always thinks he knows what is going on, or how things should be done. Even if that's not always the case, he seems like a nice enough guy, but he also feels a little too full of himself, and he has too much of a need to be in charge. At least this far into the show. Susan. In their first episode, Susan was really mysterious and intriguing, but seeing her in the following parts, we got a lot of her screaming and freaking out. And I understand that she would likely be distressed if her grandfather was in danger, but the show definitely overplayed the aspect to an unwarranted degree. And there was one moment where it seemed like Susan was going to have a time to shine, and she began to discover an idea with the skulls and the torches, and I was really excited. But as quickly as that came, Ian took it over because he feels the need to be in charge every single time. So I hope he does not always do that. I really want to see her be smart and shine. The Doctor is a really interesting character at this point in his life, at least for me knowing his future incarnations. I'm very interested in his relationship with his granddaughter, and I want the show to explore more of that because that's just the aspect of the show that I'm really most interested in about knowing more about. And also I'm very interested to see what situations the show is going to put this incarnation of the Doctor in that will challenge him in different ways. And I think with challenging circumstances, I will get to understand him even better. And the same could be said for like every character ever written, I suppose, but you understand my point, I'm sure. Back to the whole screaming thing. That was definitely too much for me, and I definitely think that has to do with the fact that the show was made in the 1960s, and as a result, some of the stereotypes and sexism makes their way into the show from the 60s culture. And, for example, a perfect example is this exchange between Ian and the Doctor.
We've been too long as it is. Is the stretcher ready?
Yes.
All right, you take one end of it.
You don't expect me to carry him, do you?
Do you want the women to do the job for you?
Oh, pretty well.
So there are some things like that, but they're relatively small and not a huge hindrance on my enjoyment of the show, even though I do not like them. Something I do like about this story is the idea of the Doctor not really having much control over the TARDIS at this point. I think that will work well as a storytelling device, and it also means that we don't have to deal with putting Barbara and Ian back in their timeline because we can't. So I think that was a really good idea, and it's a little different to what I'm used to seeing in New Who. The first episode was really good, but the follow-ups were a little bit disappointing, and even though they had their moments and were overall pretty good, they definitely dragged the first part's rating down, and overall I'm going to give this story a 7.75 out of 10. If you join me this coming Sunday, then I'll be talking about the Daleks in its entirety. I've never seen it before, but I'm very much looking forward to it, and my prediction is that the radiation bit at the end of the last episode won't come up in the Daleks episode at all, but maybe I'm wrong. We'll have to find out 1 week from now when I give you my thoughts on that episode. So thanks for watching, and please let me know what you thought about An Unearthly Child in the comments below. I hope to see you again this coming Sunday. Take care, and have a lovely week.